In unison.
Now? Yeah? Okay. Sure. So we are here to hear Candice introduce us to her wonderful book that just came out. Candice Shelby is one of our top-notch professors in the philosophy department, and she does everything. She's amazing. She can teach anything. And her latest work has been on addiction. So please join me in welcoming Candice Shelby, who's going to present the latest book.
I'm not actually going to talk about this book all this much. I just thought getting Liz to buy some food would be a good thing. So I'm going to read you the preface of this book. It's a page long, so it shouldn't bother anybody too much. And maybe you will you'll see the motivation for the book, and then I can explain to you, if you don't know the rest of my approach. I will try to explain my very complicated approach, because that's what philosophers often do, is complicate things that everybody else already thinks is clear. So here it is. In 2001, my father dropped dead of a heart attack while shaving. His doctors had told him for 50 years that he needed to quit smoking, and he did, at least 1,000 times. Pipes, cigars, plastic straws, all led back to cigarettes. Increasing blood pressure readings had no effect on the puffing. In 2006, my sister died at a bus stop from cardiac arrest, which was brought on by a fractured skull, which happened as a result of a fall during a seizure, which happened because not enough drugs were in her system to keep her upright. In 2009, it was my mother, following 3 months on life support after aspirating into her lungs as a result of taking an overdose of prescription drugs that were brought to the hospital by outside friends. My mother and sister had both been through innumerable addiction treatment centers, and my sister through 2 years of prison with no effect whatsoever. These experiences left me with firm belief that addiction is not what the treatment industry says it is, and it certainly isn't reliably treated with the approaches typically offered. Although most contemporary clinicians working in the addiction recovery field typically refer to addiction as a biopsychosocial disorder, when it comes to action, the profession seems deaf to its own characterization. Instead of addressing the triad of biological, psychological, and sociological disturbances that, according to their own definitions, addicts suffer, what we see in the addiction treatment world is a proliferation of treatment centers based on 12-step programs. These programs are self-described as spiritual, which may be the explanation for why little high-quality medical or psychological treatment makes its way into these facilities. Instead, most are staffed by former addicts with little formal education. When patients enter from these centers, relapse following their release, they're invited to return for another round of treatment. My mother did, over and over again, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars of my grandfather's and my father's money. The response: it works if you work it. Regardless of how much is spent by patients' families, or what claims are made on the front end by the rehab facilities, few people make successful life changes based on the model of having a disease for which one needs treatment. Nor, despite popular belief, do a significant proportion of those who try 12-step programs succeed over the long haul. If addiction is a spiritual disease, then work needs to be done to shore up the spiritual cure. I think that what we need to do is to increase addicts' chances of living happy, productive lives, and I think that the way to do this goes much deeper and is much more radical than most can imagine. So my view is, overdoing everything as philosophers will do, is starting at the ontological level, understanding human beings as processes with levels and levels and levels of emergent properties, which then, within complex systems create more emergent properties, need to be understood not as static, not as diagnosable into categories, not as stuck, not as patients, not as addicts, but as individuals who run into syndromes. So we know that the vast majority of people who become addicted to anything overcome that, get out of that pattern by the time they're in their 30s to their 40s. So there are 4 huge national studies that show that the reasons why people come out of addiction when they do has to do with their brains finally maturing, with their having important and valuable alternatives in their lives, responsibilities, things that give their lives meaning. But I don't want to say in that account that addiction is simply a moral failing that teenagers fall into either, because that's not the case, obviously, and we know that with the proliferation of the prescription opioids that we have a much older population now becoming addicted to these drugs, and still, I mean, for not such terribly different reasons than the teenagers do, because if you have a kind of chronic pain or chronic illness that's going to lead you to be prescribed these kind of opioids over a long period of time, the sort of motivations to get out of addiction are going to be absent in the same way that they are in those teens and 20-year-old people who think themselves, well, what they tend to think, I can always get over this later. So that I don't need to address this now. And there's this anyway, there are any number of studies that we can show you that I can tell you that show how people emerge from this pattern when there's something better to do, when they feel valued, and when they have other things going on. Now, this book takes you through genetic, epigenetic levels of analysis. We talk about early childhood trauma, later ongoing trauma, stressful lives, alienated lives. We talk about attachments. I talk about attachment theory, what happens when we have insecure attachments growing up. And I do a social critique of our of the addictive culture in which the global economy grew up, by which I mean that we see that in many cultures, those who were the indentured workers were often given substances that would make their intolerable lives more tolerable. So the problem is the solution, and the solution is the problem. So people are, in order to get these global economies working, we've got cocoa beans given to the people who are working in South America. We've got the opiate poppy given to the people in China and India. We've got our Americans' East Coast was developed largely on the strength of tobacco, for which all of the black slaves were given rations constantly. And we still do it because you get to have, I mean, the coffee break was instituted as the American workforce moved into offices, which are deadly boring and exhausting. And so the whole idea of the coffee break, cigarette break, right? That thing is included because what happens is this keeps people working. But there's a problem with that, of course, when those kinds of substances are refined, because then when substances are refined, particularly as you move out of agricultural kinds of means of production into industrial means of production and intellectual means of production, when people are drinking quarts of gin instead of swilling weak beer, you have a different outcome. And so now these people will be demonized. When you have people using refined opiate substances rather than chewing poppy, you have people who don't actually want to work on the railroad so much. When you have, right, they just act. So when you have people, and you notice which drugs didn't gain traction as addictive substances in these places, although they were used by all kinds of people. Drugs like ayahuasca, drugs like LSD, drugs like psilocybin mushrooms. Why? Well, because if you're tripping, you might not remember how to do work, or that there is work, or, right? It's not the same as having somebody picking your tea leaves while you've got them chewing poppy because their backs are breaking doing to the tea plants are short. So they're bending over all day long. So we have, what I have tried to say in here, and that's all I think I'm going to say, is that this, my analysis of addiction is as an emergent property from an emergent entity, which I take to be minds, human minds in particular, although other animals do use drugs, and they will, I mean, they'll eat things and get loopy and all of that. They don't do what we do. They don't, persist to the expense of other things. So in the emergent mind of self-aware human beings stuck within social systems that are exploitative, alienating, fear-inducing, competitive, we find that the response of certain people, and this is predicated on other parts of these complex, very complex systems, but many people have a very heightened adrenal system, the HPA system, right? So what that means is that the set point for agitation, for anxiety, for discomfort is because of childhood tragedies, because of traumas, because of failure to attach to parents, because of genetic, all of these things, my way of understanding it is all of these things are interactive all the way up. You find genetics expressing in phenotypes, and those phenotypes then, developing traits. These people are, so that we have human beings who are being raised by caregivers who either are or are not attentive, which means that their ability to self-regulate, their stressed mothers, exhausted mothers, and absent mothers, fathers, there be mothers, whoever it is that's taking care of the child, give rise to an elevated HPA system, which means these people are hypersensitive to stress, and then we live in very stressful world, and not every part of the world is the same, and I don't mean to say that the remarks that I make are largely focused on addiction in the U.S., although I did a significant amount of research about Western Europe and South America as well. I understand, I'm going to go teach in China in next month, and I understand that their problem is not with addictive substances so much as devices, but parents are putting children in rehab because of their addiction to devices, or they don't have access to drugs. I guess people will do what they need to do to feel better is the point. And if you are normally feeling okay, and you have a glass of wine, or you have a Percocet, or you have a whatever, you're going to feel better. But if you are feeling anxious, and you are feeling distressed, and you have no ability to self-resolve your own emotional discomfort, then you're going to be making a move that's more like, oh, and a glass of wine like that. Oh, right. And so when teenagers get going, because they're all jazzed up and they're all terribly upset about everything all the time, we see that their tendency to become addicted is way greater than people later in life. They have not such a strong ability. They're just barely learning how to do emotional self-control. So that added into a society which is demanding in many different ways, and increasingly so. My analysis is, without any of those things, you wouldn't get addiction in the form that we see it. But we've got, even one more layer that is really added to the discussion in the last 10 years, and that is that although Americans constitute 5% of the population, we ingest 50% of the world's pharmaceuticals. So there's a power in pharmaceutical companies that goes pretty much unchecked because they're international, just like the oil companies have their power, then we have problems with that. I don't know if I call it addiction, but we'll call it something. Dependence. So we got the same sort of thing with pharmaceutical companies, because the numbers that I looked at, I had to look them up in my own book yesterday because I forgot how to quote myself to somebody. about the amount of money that has shifted into the hands of the pharmaceutical companies is shocking. So gambling, yes. So, this is just a couple of examples. In 2010, Novo Nordisk saw $2.67 billion in sales. 2009, Bristol Myers Squibb's revenues had reached $18.8 billion. But it's the astronomical rate in rise in these companies' revenues that's most striking. Eli Lilly's profits, for example, rose from $875 million in 2003 to $23 billion in 2010. As a result of the Medicare prescription drug plan of 2003, which all Republicans will remember standing right behind George Bush were signing on to, this group of legislators, each of whom received hundreds of thousands of dollars on campaign funding from pharmaceutical companies, realized for the pharmaceutical company industry an $8 billion increase in profit. Now, I'm not going to say that it's our legislators or our pharmaceutical companies that are the center of our addiction. We've had addiction before that, but I would certainly say that when you're thinking about complex dynamic systems and how one little change in input can create massive changes in output, when you think about big changes like this within systems in which human beings are interacting and changing each other all the time, you're seeing something that, shall we say, it's significant. Yeah, I mean, Bristol Myers Squibb, even when it became clear that the people were chopping up the OxyContin and sniffing and whatever, they said, oh, no problem, we'll prevent that. We will make it where it can't break down that fast. So they put a coating on the top, which meant that if you chop it all up, the coating is still gone. But in the meantime, they're still selling OxyContin, oxycodone, hydrocodone, all of those. So they said, okay, we don't care, because now we realize they'll buy it no matter what we do. They put a coating on the outside that actually does make it impossible to chop it up and snort it to get the same effect as morphine, but it doesn't matter because the addictive properties are still the same, whether you take them through your mouth or whether you put them in your soda or whether you shove it up your nose. So we've got this, I mean, somebody's got a vested interest in, somebody almost always has had a vested interest in having somebody else addicted. So it's important for us to realize that this is not simply about some people who have a disease. In fact, I'll just tell you one story about the disease and I will stop and we can talk. You might have heard about there are two major studies that really show what goes on with the alleged disease. First of all, anybody know who Mitch Hedberg is? Comedian, right? He says, yeah, addiction's a disease. It's the only one people can yell at you for having. Mitch, you're an alcoholic. Mitch, you have lupus, right? Something doesn't sound right. So, like that, right? So we understand that there's something else going on than this. And anyway, if it's a disease, why are we going to God? Because the only thing I can tell you about that is that we haven't done that since Asclepius. And that's pretty long. So I thought with Galen and everybody who were getting out of that particular kind of practice. Not to mention that the 12-step program approach has no better than spontaneous recovery rates of improvement. People say millions of people have gotten well with AA. Yes, they have. And millions of people have gotten well by putting down the bottle. It does, or the pills, or whatever it is that they're doing. So without any better than spontaneous rates of remission, one might wonder why people would go into a cult. And I I don't know what to say about that, except people like cults. And they like to be welcomed by somebody and feel better. And the law now, apparently, I just learned this the other day, not only legally can require treatment, they've changed it slightly because they can't require AA in particular because some suits have been won about the God part. But they can require that you go into treatment, and given that there aren't very many alternatives, it's basically amounts to the same thing. The other thing that I was going to say about that was, and a person that I just talked to the other day said that he had been told by his insurance company now, because this was a huge, huge factor in developing the rehab treatment industry in the United States. 1987, the AMA declared addiction disease, which meant that it got coded by the DSM and by the World Health Organization's coding practices, which meant that you could now have third-party payers. What does that mean? Insurance gets into the mix. So insurance can now pay for you to go to rehab 3 times, 4 times, 7 times, and if you don't get better, it's just your fault, so just go again, and we'll pay for it again. And so the only time I've just heard about insurance, the most striking thing in the last few weeks was one guy said that he was told by his insurance that he had to have a sponsor by day 10, or they would not pay for any more of his rehab. So even though the law can't mandate 12-step, insurance can mandate a sponsor, which mandates a 12-step because that's the program they're using. So, but it's not better than chance in terms of remission. So we wonder why that is why that's the methodology that is 95% of the treatment offered in the United States is 12-step. So I think that there might be some other methods, and there are some other methods. There's serious research being done on, for example, trauma therapy. Trauma therapy can include MDMA. With MDMA, you know, I've heard about ecstasy and the touchy, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, this is an active ingredient there, but what it does is allow people it allows their disconnect between themselves and others to diminish, so that there's high level of trust, high level of well-being felt. So they're going through a full day, and in 3 treatments, people go through a somatic revisitation of their trauma, and it's been resolved in 80% of the cases. Ayahuasca is another, it's a hallucinogen that is used in Peru and in Mexico. They opened a church in Washington State. Because psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, ayahuasca, ibogaine, all of these drugs can be used they can be used just for fun, but they could also be used in clinical environment. And what they do, what the brain scan showed that these kind of hallucinogens do, is allow the brain to, it looks more like a baby brain than it does like an adult brain, with very tight synaptic connections and very tight networks already formed, and it looks like tight modules. All of those activities are much depressed. So Johns Hopkins has done a big study using it. NYU has done a big study using it. Stanford's got an ongoing study using it. Gabor Mate, who's written a bunch of books, he was a physician in Vancouver. He's a nice enough guy, but he's got a group that he takes down to South America and does ayahuasca treatments over 3 days. And the success rates there are remarkably different than they are from the spiritual cure. But what I was going to tell you about our environment, and this is, swear to God, the last thing I'll say, is the famous Vietnam study, right? So we had a whole bunch of people in Vietnam. Don't know if you know about that, but we did. And most of them got addicted to heroin. So in order to get back, you had to test clean. They wouldn't send you home stateside unless you tested. So they put people through, the rehab places, lock the doors and all the things to get them clean and go through they didn't have Suboxone or anything at the time, so you go through the hard get off it thing. But when you have 90-something% addiction rates in Vietnam, they come home and 2 years later, 3 years later, they're interviewing the same guys, and after they're home and they got reinstilled in their lives and all of that, the rate of addiction among Vietnam vets was no higher than the standard population, than the population as a whole in the United States. So what does it mean? Man, it sucks to be in Vietnam, right? So I could see that, because I would do heroin if I were in the jungle too, being shot at all the time. That would, sure, because my nerves would be shot. So you might as well be dead, but if you're not, then at least you can be high. So there was a similar study done with rats by Bruce Alexander in Canada, and what they did with the rats was there were 4 different conditions that they tested. Some rats were raised in rat cages, tested in rat cages. Others were raised in what they call rat park, where they made them big cages with fun rat stuff and rat friends and rat parties and all kinds of rat food and everything. And they got to live there the whole time, and then they tested them in cages. And then they had the same rat park kids, and they tested them still in rat park. And what they found was, and this is a morphine addiction test, so it's the same opiate stuff going on. I forgot the fourth one is. It's the neurological. You see what I'm saying? There are 4 logical possibilities there. But the point is that the rats that were raised in rat park. Oh, do you know how they test rats to see if they're addicted to? You've always seen this. They put them on the cocaine, and then they go, oh, they'll just tap themselves to death, right? Well, here's one reason why. Because they put them on a pedestal and they stick them where they can't move, and they put the drip in their head, and then they push the button and they feel better. So, kind of like Vietnam, who wouldn't push the button until they feel better to death? So these rats that were tested in rat park, the other ones were raised in cages, then tested in rat park, right? So when they tested these rat park rats, as opposed to caged rats, regular caged rats, what they found is that morphine's bitter, right? So rats don't really like it. But the ones that were raised in cages went after the morphine. The ones that were raised in rat park, they were pretty happy. They wouldn't drink it even when they kept putting honey in it, kept putting to make it sweeter and sweeter, because rats like sugar. When they kept sweetening, the rats would drink water every time. They weren't being shot in the head. They were instead just being offered morphine solution. And those rats didn't want it. So the story, part of the story about this very complex interactive system that I'm trying to tell in this little book is that the answers, people hate to know that the answers to a hard problem are hard. People like to know there's a universal principle, you got the causation, you caused it, that'll fix it, right? So either it's your fault, and typically, no matter which way this story plays out, it's your fault, right? If you're addicted, it's because either you're diseased or because you're bad. The story that I'm trying to tell is, no, it's not about you or me. It's about all of us, including our mothers, including our fathers, the environments, the caretakers, everybody, all the way up the pole, and including, unfortunately, the serious problems that we never want to address. Those are the social problems that we have with alienation, meaningless work, poverty, and of course, you know where you find most addiction in our populations are exactly in the places where we blame people for being bad. Those terrible ghetto people who are useless and don't work and don't do anything. You think they're drinking and drugging because of the conditions, or do you think? Anyway, you see the point. The social circumstances have everything to do with it as well. So my last chapter in here is just about offering an entire continuum of suggestions for ways in which we can, first for any given individual and then for us as a group, mitigate this addiction problem that we are currently still enhancing, because the epidemic is still growing, particularly with prescription drugs, and that happened because of the war on drugs. Because when you close one, it's like playing whack-a-mole. When you close one thing down, it's going to pick up somewhere else. So that's not the answer. Obviously, lots of countries have figured that out. There are social answers that I would suggest. There are physical answers that I would suggest. There are psychological answers that I would suggest, and all of that. But anyway, that's what I did for 3 weeks. This is what I did on my summer vacation. So if you want to talk about anything, we can. And if you don't, well, then we can eat. I still like to do that. I mean, I especially like to do that. You know?
Go ahead. I want to go back to the beginning of the talk and just try to clarify in my own mind some of the points that you made. One of them was that as a teenager becomes a 30-year-old, he or she the other was the example of the Vietnam vet who comes back to the States, and the first one suggests that the 30-year-old finds something better. Maybe it's career, maybe it's family, whatever. The Vietnam vet comes back, finds the same thing, but in both situations, an entire context for each of the individuals. Much of our treatment of disease is biological. In other words, you could say, okay, she has a high adrenaline count, let's give her a drug. And what you're suggesting is that the drug isn't going to work in and of itself. That in fact, the drug could return you to the exact same place without that change in context. So something better has to be contextual, right? Okay,
Yeah, I mean, the next thing I want to work on is motivation. I want to think about some more, because it really is, I mean, one of the reasons why people like to go to rehab and they will go back again is because it changes the whole context. It's, my mother used to go to them as a vacation, right? They had horses, they had swimming pools, tennis, and she was like, oh, I'm so addicted to this. You know, right, some more thousands of dollars, go. But you can imagine that people getting out of their homes and out of their ruts and out of their day-to-day job experience, go somewhere else where they get to do something else and focus on something peaceful and do nice things. They certainly have a much better chance of getting away enough to make some sort of break. And we often do that. I mean, whether it's relationships or whether it's bad jobs or whether it's something else, we often we're more complicated. It's not simply that that we can say, oh, well, you know, change your job, go work in that station, and you'll be all together. Yeah, it's not like that. There's a program in Colorado right now that's called Go Sober, and it's based on gabapentin. The whole thing. The program is you go in, you infuse. Now, GABA plays an important role in the metabolizing alcohol, because alcohol is more complicated than either cocaine or nicotine or opiates. Because alcohol works on both opiate receptors and it suppresses GABA production. But GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Without the inhibition transmitter, the glutamate goes crazy. And so you get this overactive dopamine production in that, but it's a really roundabout way of getting dopamine production or available dopamine. And so this guy invented this program for just $9,200. You can go to Longmont and he will shoot you up with gabapentin for some hours a day. And they have a nutritionist and what else do they have? A nutrition, there was one other thing. A Reiki person or something. Yeah.
It's also massage therapy.
Yeah, massage, and
But
then
it's also
you're gonna not be an addict anymore. If your addiction is alcohol. So it's just, there you go.
But then when you go back home,
Oh, that. Right, yeah, but it's got a line that, I looked at the sign and said, and it's exactly false. So I wouldn't do that. But, you know, people will tell you that any number of things will, there are drugs like Suboxone that are very useful, that it's an improvement over what methadone was, and for people who have been long-time heroin users, for example, and their body simply will not take the pain that comes, because you're more sensitized to pain after you've been on opiates and you get off than you were before. Oh, sure, it's like everything, you know, there's a reaction. Now, some people stay on Suboxone for decades, and they do fine. Some people use it but they don't do it just with Suboxone. You can't simply slide somebody a drug and think, oh, it's over now. Because they also have to have other things. There's a big component to addiction that simply has to do with habit. And if going to AA meetings does anything for you, it replaces the habit of drinking at 6 o'clock every evening, because that's when they run. So they set up a meeting, so you got something else to do. And then that's one reason that cults are very, I mean, it's a thing to do. And they welcome you in, and they scare you when you try to leave. But that, you know, habituation is a big part of addiction, and sometimes just getting it out of the context, getting away from the habit long enough, it allows people the freedom to make choices and to do the other kind of psychological work or whatever the need is, or when they have allows it to stop the addiction.
So here's a super simplification.
Okay, that's what I like. Here it goes, 4 words.
Which is why it's overly small. But it sounds like this. So, yeah, multiple factors: genetic, biological, social, conditioning, settings, etc. But all these factors seem to be contributing to just a general anxiety disorder. That seem to be distorted.
It's one.
Right? Is that it's self-medicated anxiety?
I have a phenomenology chapter in there. I know everybody who knows me is going to think that it's false, but it's really in there. Because I was interested in just that question, that's what it seemed like to me. Sometimes it's an underlying depression, underlying bipolar disorder. If you think those are all the same thing, okay, then it's all self-medication.
Nice and broad.
Yeah, yeah. It's not the only pattern, however. There are patterns. So in the phenomenology chapter, there are descriptive patterns of people who drank and drank and drank and drank just because it was Mad Men years and they were just at work and nothing was really a big deal. Notice after about, 30 years of that it suddenly got out of control and they were like, oh, I can't stop it. And so they did that. Then there are others who, like Owen Flanagan, that philosopher, tells the story. Well, his is actually an anxiety problem. So there's run off the tracks, there's the anxiety problem. The first time you feel it, boom, it's so different, you would do anything to feel better.
Yeah.
Then there are 2 other ones. And let me think what they are. Oh, these are the people. So one of them is partier people. So they're partiers in college, but it's binge, right? So it's binge exposure. And then they don't, and then they do, and then they don't, and then they do. And there's a really high percentage, a much higher percentage of people who binge use than people who use all the time, as you would expect somebody who's self-medicating to do, to become addicted and to have dysfunctional patterns later. So there's the partier, the weekend warriors have a tendency to run into problems by the time you're in your 20s or 30s. So that's a third one. The fourth one, I may or may not have forgotten. But I'm sure it's out there, but I don't think it's...
I'll trust it. I was just thinking of the way that it's up.
Yeah.
It's not like that. And I figured that was just something else.
Yeah, it's because it's not the only pattern, but it's the story. That's the one. This book has it does like deep metaphysics. It does 5 different versions of biochemical addiction. It does. I mean, so there's because I feel the need to complicate things so much, it goes into a lot. I mean, I think these things are important, and I think that the irreducibility of, when I've always been a reductionist, so that's another thing that people probably think I don't actually mean, but the irreducibility of the emergent syndrome to any one of these things, I think is what I found most striking. Because I really find very interesting. I mean, there's even a semantic chapter in there, a discussion of how it is that addicts or people who are suffering from addiction and people who are living with them, love them, and all of that, don't speak the same language. Because concept acquisition is always, right, concept acquisition is, in my understanding, holistic. It's always about carving out from the noise so that babies just experience noise and they begin to, right, neurons fire together, begin to experience the comfort, the warmth with a particular set of facial features. So they learn to pick out one thing, and then they learn to pick out a few things, and then they learn to pick out more. And they're in elementary school, they live in a different world, but all concepts are always affective, right? So they're always emotionally laden in some way. What happens as someone becomes addicted, and is the affect level, right, is that what things mean. If you think about meaning in terms of holism, then what things mean is going to be very different if something comes to be extremely positive for you, or extremely valuable, extremely important, even if it's not positive. Because many people hate their addictions. Not all do, many like them and they just want to stay with them. But many hate their addiction, but what they're saying when they say, I love you, I want to quit, is exactly what they mean. And when you say, if you love me, you wouldn't do that, you would stop that, they say, what are you talking about? Right? So it's a little bit of a long story how those kinds of separate meaning systems can come to be, but it also provides me with an analysis of why it is that people can be going along with a set of, I know I've been sober for 4 years, I know what the meanings of things are in the world, I know this is bad for me, blah, 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 blah. Walk past the bar on the wrong day, the wrong time, the wrong smell, the wrong experience, the wrong too hungry, too something. And not only is there ego depletion in place where we don't have the capacity to control ourselves, but there's also the meanings of things. But this, which I took to be my poison, right? And I'm talking to people about this, dealing with my therapist, and all of that, starts to come to be seen as the only, it's like metamorphosis, right? It's the only way I could possibly get through this day would be another shot. So all of this is very naturally based. I don't see anything that is not naturally based, but I don't, because of the way that I understand the way physics works and the whole rest of the world, I don't think that that addiction is reducible to a biochemical reaction or predisposition or any of those other things, because the thing is that brains emerge they emerge out of nothing, right? They self-develop their organization in an environment, right? We got 2 cells, and all of these cells are developing. So we're not talking about a brain that's been something done to it, but it is the very way in which it is developed in that body, inside that other body, that's inside that world. That's really what we have to think about. And that's why it's massively complicated, but I don't think that that means that there are no answers. I think it means the opposite. Because anything that has the structure of complex dynamic theory says that there are shelves, there are levels, where different places. Many physical examples of this can be brought together, that any number of ends are available where you could simply have small change made in one place, another place, that would then generate the sort of camel that, I mean, the straw that broke the camel's back sort of. I think about it as dropping sand, right? Sand, 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 sand. You could drop them and they all go up, but every once in a while you make a. And when you're dealing with complex dynamic systems in which all of the components are interacting with one another and they're adapting, right? So an adaptive system. There are any number of ways that you can get an inroad to making a change that will make a huge change somewhere else. Just by meditating there anywhere. Can we eat now? Okay. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, you have a pen. You believe that?
I do, because if you take already a high amount of it, you're going to have exact knowledge, it's going to be the same.
Yes, that's right. 3,000 milligrams or so.
300 milligrams is not but 3,000.
Yeah, they allow them to take up to, yeah, 3,000.
Well, it's because epileptics, the reason for epilepsy, right?
Yeah.
It's up to 4,000.
One of the big problems is the difficulty of having to cross the blood-brain barrier, isn't it? As Jeff mentioned, that's why
There's
effects on the physical system, and then that's one of the reasons when you're doing like psychological stuff that you have to use such high dosages. You don't actually always know how much is going to cross the blood-brain barrier, so they just
that's with
throw
everything,
in 10
right?
milligrams at
Well,
it.
You don't know.
In hopes that they
It's
can
water soluble.
So it won't be a
Right.
problem. You're not
Yeah,
going to have it
right.
stuck in your.
Yeah, no, exactly,
It's not
right,
gonna be
yeah.
Hey there, how are you doing, man? It's good to see you.
Yeah.